A backpack found stuck between rocks after 19 years changes everything. The sun beat down on the granite face of the fin, a shard of rock that scraped the California sky, its surface shimmering with a heat that felt ancient and predatory. For Maya, it was a pilgrimage. For Ben, it was just another Tuesday, another chance to feel the familiar burn in his forearms and the exhilarating emptiness of the air beneath his heels. They moved in sync, a rhythmic dance of chalked hands and clipped carabiners, their voices small against the vast, indifferent silence of the high Sierra. It had been 6 hours since they'd seen another soul. 6 hours of nothing but the rasp of their own breathing and the soft, metallic click of their gear. See that ledge? Ben's voice was a puff of air, barely carrying over the wind that whipped through the pass. 20 more feet. We can rest there. Maya didn't answer. She was focused on a crack in the rock, a dark fissure that ran like a jagged scar. Just to her left, something was caught in it, something that didn't belong. It was a flash of faded color, a patch of worn nylon, blue as a robin's egg but bleached by years of relentless sun and snow. Ben, she said, her voice tight. Hold up, what's wrong? You good? There's something stuck in that crevice. He followed her gaze, squinting. Probably just trash. Some asshole probably ditched their gear. It was common enough. The wilderness was littered with the ghosts of other people's failed ambitions. But this was different. It was wedged deep, impossibly deep, as if the mountain itself had tried to swallow it. As Maya drew closer, her fingers tracing the lip of the crevice, she could see. It was a backpack, an old one, the kind with external aluminum frames that had gone out of style decades ago. It was pinned between two massive, unmoving granite teeth, held in a chokehold by the geology of time. It's really in there, she said, her knuckles brushing against the cold, rough stone. A shiver, unrelated to the wind, traced its way down her spine. The thing looked like a tombstone. For the next hour, the climb was forgotten. They became archaeologists, their mission singular and obsessive: to excavate this strange relic from its stone prison. Ben used the claw of his climbing hammer, chipping away at the smaller rocks that had fallen in around the pack, his grunts echoing in the thin air. Maya worked with her hands, her fingers raw and bleeding as she pulled at the stubborn fabric. The sun beat down, turning the rock into a griddle. Sweat dripped into their eyes, stinging. The pack refused to yield. It was as if it wanted to stay buried, to keep its secrets. Finally, with a gut-wrenching groan of tearing canvas and scraping metal, it came free. It tumbled onto the ledge, with a heavy, muffled thud that sounded unnervingly like a body hitting the ground. They stood over it, panting, their chests heaving. It was heavier than it had any right to be. The faded blue nylon was tattered, shredded in places, but the leather straps, though cracked and stiff, were mostly intact. A name was written in faded black marker on the top flap, the letters warped by water and time, but still legible. Leo. Wave of profound wrongness washed over Maya. This wasn't just lost gear. This was a lost person. Ben, ever the pragmatist, unclipped the main buckles. They broke apart in his hands, brittle as old bones. He peeled back the flap. The smell that wafted out was a damp, musty tomb scent, an odor of decay and long abandoned places. Inside, nestled among a moldy sleeping bag and a rusty cookpot, was a collection of a life interrupted, a worn copy of Kerouac's Dharma Bums, its pages swollen and fused together. A half-eaten bag of trail mix, the nuts and raisins, now a single, petrified lump, a tin whistle. And underneath it all, a small oilskin pouch. Maya reached for it, her hands trembling slightly. Her fingers felt cold, numb. Inside the pouch, things were better preserved. There was a leather-bound journal, the cover stiff and warped, but the pages inside seemingly dry. There was a disposable camera, a cheap yellow Kodak that felt like a plastic time capsule. And there was a silver locket, tarnished almost black, hanging from a delicate, broken chain. She worked the clasp of the locket with her thumbnail. It sprang open. The tiny photo inside was faded, the colors bleeding into a soft, ghostly watercolor. It showed a girl's face, laughing, her hair wild halo around her head, her eyes alight with a joy so pure it was heartbreaking. On the back, etched in a delicate looping script, were the words, "My heart is yours, A." Ben had opened the journal. "Jesus," he breathed. The pages were filled with a neat, dense script, the ink slightly feathered from the damp. It was a travelogue, filled with observations about the light on the peaks, the taste of wild strawberries, the ache of a body pushed to its limits. The writer, Leo, had a poet's soul. He wrote about feeling small under the vast starry sky, about the profound peace of being utterly alone. But the tone of the final entries shifted. The neat script grew frantic, the lines slanting downwards. August 14, 2006, the second entry read, "Something feels off today. The silence isn't peaceful anymore, it's watching me. I saw another hiker this morning, way down the trail, tall guy, wearing a red jacket. I waved, but he just stood there, staring. Maybe I'm just getting spooked, too long on my own." The last entry was dated the next day, August 15th. The handwriting was a chaotic slash of ink, the words barely legible, as if written in a desperate hurry, the pen digging into the paper. "He's here, followed me off trail. The guy in red, Silas, he called himself, said he was a ranger, but his eyes, God, his eyes. Something's wrong with him. He asked about my route, where I was going, if anyone knew I was here. I lied. I told him my brother was meeting me at Tuolumne Meadows. He just smiled. It wasn't a real smile. It was like a wolf baring its teeth. He said the mountains keep secrets. He knows I'm alone. He's waiting for me. I'm hiding in the rocks near the falls. If anyone finds this, tell my father." The sentence ended there. A final, jagged slash of ink trailed off the page, as if the writer's hand had been violently jerked away. A cold dread, sharp and metallic as the taste of blood, filled Maya's mouth. This wasn't a story. This was a final testament. Years, this journal had been sitting here, waiting. 19 years, this boy's last. Terrified thoughts had been trapped in this stone coffin. "We have to call someone," Maya whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Now, Ben was staring at the disposable camera in his hand. "What do you think is on this?" The question hung in the air, heavy and menacing. What horrors were captured on that roll of film? What was the last thing Leo saw? The descent was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every shadow seemed to stretch, to take on a human form. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. They didn't speak. They couldn't. They were bound by the terrible knowledge they now carried, the weight of Leo's last moments. They drove for 2 hours, the silent, imposing peaks of the Sierra Nevada receding in the rearview mirror like silent, complicit witnesses. They found a 1-hour photo place in a dusty strip mall in the first town they came to. A place that smelled of chemicals and faded dreams. The pimply teenager behind the counter gave them a weird look when they handed him the disposable camera, but he shrugged and took their money. They waited in the car, the engine off, the silence thick and suffocating. An hour felt like a lifetime. When the kid finally came out, holding a thin paper envelope, he looked pale. "You guys find this, like on a dead body or something?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Some of these are messed up." They snatched the envelope and spread the photos on the dashboard of their beat-up Subaru. The first dozen were exactly what you'd expect. A young man, probably 23, with a wide, infectious grin and sun-bleached hair, standing on a peak with his arms outstretched. Leo, posing with a deer. Leo, filtering water from a crystal-clear stream. He was beautiful, vibrant, radiating a kind of golden boy energy. You could see the joy in his face, the sheer love for the wilderness. But then, the photos began to change. The grin faded, replaced by a more subdued, pensive expression. The landscapes became darker, more claustrophobic. There was a photo of his campsite, taken from a distance, as if he were trying to see it from an outsider's perspective. Then, a blurry shot of a distant figure in a red jacket, just a speck of color against the gray rock. The last 3 photos were the ones that had shaken the kid in the photo lab. The third to last was a shot of Leo's own boots, caked in mud. Taken from above, it was an odd, disorienting angle. The second to last was a close-up of the silver locket, held in his palm. It looked like a final, desperate prayer. And then, there was the final picture. It took their breath away. It was taken in near darkness. The flash, a harsh, brutal explosion of light that bleached out all the color. It was a selfie, taken from a low angle. Leo's face filled the frame, but it wasn't the face from the earlier photos. This was a mask of pure, primal terror. His eyes were wide, white all around, staring at something just over the camera's shoulder. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his teeth bared. His skin was slick with sweat and grime. Tears streamed down his cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dirt. It was the face of a man looking directly into the face of his own death. And behind him, just at the edge of the flash's reach, was a shape, a shadow, a presence. It was blurry, indistinct, but unmistakably human. A broad shoulder, the collar of a jacket, the side of a face obscured by the harsh glare and the deep shadows. It was the thing he was looking at. The thing that was about to kill him. Maya let out a small, strangled gasp and slapped a hand over her mouth, her stomach heaving. Ben's face was ashen. He snatched his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. He dialed 911, his voice cracking as he tried to explain what they had found. They were transferred to the county sheriff's department, a sleepy, rural jurisdiction. An older man answered, his voice thick with the slow, weary cadence of someone who had seen it all and was tired of most of it. Sheriff's Department, Deputy Miller speaking. Ben, his voice shaking, recounted the story. The backpack, the crevice, the name, Leo. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a beat of silence that was suddenly sharp, focused, and heavy with unspoken history. The weariness in the deputy's voice vanished, replaced by something else. Something hard, and cold, and guarded. What was the last name on that pack? Miller's voice was clipped, precise. There wasn't one, Ben stammered. Just Leo. Another pause, longer this time. Maya could hear the faint sound of a chair creaking, of a man shifting his weight, and the journal, Miller said, not a question, but a command. What did it say? It mentioned another hiker, a guy named Silas. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound, so total, that Maya thought the line had gone dead. She could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. When Deputy Miller finally spoke again, his voice was a low, dangerous whisper. Where are you, kids, right now? Ben told him the name of the town, the strip mall. Stay there, don't move. Don't talk to anyone. Don't touch anything else from that pack. Do you understand me? I'm on my way. I'll be there in an hour. The line went dead. Ben lowered the phone, his hand trembling. Maya stared at the final photograph, at the raw terror frozen forever in a cheap chemical emulsion. The shadow behind Leo seemed to pulse, to move. The static of the phone call, the sudden intensity of the deputy, the 19 years of silence, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying certainty. This wasn't just a cold case, it was a hot one. It had been smoldering for 19 years in that rock crevice, and they had just fanned it into a roaring, hungry flame. They sat in the car, the doors locked, the windows rolled up, the garish colors of the setting sun bleeding across the sky. The heat of the day was fading, replaced by a creeping desert chill. They felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the shadow from the photograph had detached itself and was now hunting for them. The strip mall, once a beacon of civilization, now felt isolated and dangerous. The silence in the car stretched, pulled taut by fear. Maya kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her eyes scanning the parking lot. Ben just stared straight ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. This is bad, isn't it? Maya whispered. Yeah, Ben said, his voice barely audible. This is really, really bad. A car pulled into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across their windshield, momentarily blinding them. It wasn't a police cruiser, It was an old, beaten-up truck. It parked a few spots away, its engine idling. Maya couldn't see the driver through the tinted glass. Her heart seized. He knows I'm alone. Leo's words echoed in her mind. Then behind them, from the darkened alley that ran alongside the strip mall, came a sound. The sharp, distinct snap of a twig breaking under a heavy foot. Ben's head whipped around. Maya froze. Her breath caught in her throat. They were staring into the deep, impenetrable darkness of the alley. They couldn't see anything, but they could feel it. A presence. They were being watched. The shadow was no longer in the photograph. It was here, and it knew they had Leo's pack. It knew they had his secrets. The silence of the mountains had followed them. The terror in Leo's eyes was now their own. They were the ones hiding in the rocks now, and the man in the red jacket was coming for them. The story wasn't over. For 19 years, it had been waiting. And now, they were part of it. The very beginning of its violent, terrible end. The man who stepped out of the shadows wasn't a monster. He was just a man. That was the most terrifying thing about him. He was old now, his shoulders stooped inside a worn flannel shirt. His face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and worry. But his eyes were the same. Maya knew it instinctively. A jolt of recognition that was primal and absolute. They were the eyes from the journal, the eyes Leo had described. They were pale, almost colorless, and they held a stillness that was deeply unsettling, like the surface of a frozen lake. This was Deputy Miller. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, his gaze sweeping over them. The car, the thin paper envelope of photos on the dashboard. He didn't look surprised or alarmed. He looked resigned, like a man arriving at a destination he had been dreading for a very long time. "You, the kids that called?" he asked, his voice the same low rumble from the phone. He didn't wait for an answer. He opened the back door of their Subaru and slid inside, bringing the cold night air with him. The cab was suddenly cramped, claustrophobic, filled with the faint scent of stale coffee and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old blood. "Give them to me," he said. It wasn't a request. His hand was outstretched, his fingers, thick and calloused. Ben, seemingly hypnotized, handed him the envelope of photos. Miller sifted through them, his expression unreadable. When he got to the last one, the terrible, final selfie, his breath hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound. He stared at it for a long moment, his thumb tracing the edge of the photograph. Right where the shadow loomed behind Leo. "Years," he murmured, to himself more than to them. "You little fool, you should have just kept walking." He tucked the photos into his jacket pocket, and then held his hand out again. The journal. Maya clutched the leather-bound book. To her chest, a wave of protectiveness, fierce and irrational, surged through her. This was Leo's voice. His last words. Giving it to this man felt like a betrayal. "Who are you?" she demanded, her own voice trembling but defiant. "Why do you care so much about this?" Miller's pale eyes settled on her. There was no anger in them, just a profound, bottomless wariness. "I was the lead on his disappearance," he said flatly. Leo Kane went missing in the Ansel Adams Wilderness, August of 2006. We searched for a month, found his car at the trailhead, nothing else. Case went cold. Became one of those stories locals tell to scare tourists. He sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the deepest part of him. I was the one who had to tell his father. The name landed in the small, cramped space of the car with the force of a physical blow. Leo Kane. He had a name, a family, a father who had waited 19 years for an answer that had just been found by two strangers on a rock face. The antagonist was never a monster in a red jacket. The antagonist was time. It was silence. It was the slow, grinding machinery of a small town's secrets. And Silas. Silas was the ghost at the center of it all. Silas Blackwood wasn't a ranger. He wasn't a cop. In 2006, he was a local legend, a cautionary tale parents told their children. He was a mountain man, a recluse who lived in a ramshackle cabin deep in the backcountry, miles from any official trail. He was a poacher, a troublemaker, a man with a rumored history of violence and a deep-seated hatred for outsiders. People said he thought the mountains belonged to him. He was tall, gaunt, and always wore a faded red hunting jacket, no matter the season. He was the first and only person of interest in Leo Kane's disappearance. Miller had interviewed him back then. He'd driven his cruiser as far as the logging roads went, and then hiked for 2 hours to Blackwood's cabin. He'd found him skinning a deer, his hands and forearms slick with blood. Silas had been calm, his eyes holding a kind of arrogant amusement. He admitted seeing a pretty boy city kid hiking near his territory. He said he'd told the kid to get lost, that the mountains had teeth, and would chew up people who didn't belong. He had an alibi, of a sort. He'd been seen by 2 other hunters at a lower elevation the day after Leo was last seen. It was flimsy, but in the absence of a body, a weapon, or any physical evidence, it was enough. The investigation stalled. Silas Blackwood remained a free man, a bogeyman who lived in the shadows of the peaks. He died of a heart attack 5 years ago, alone in his cabin, as wild and untamed as the wilderness he claimed as his own. So that's it? Ben asked, his voice incredulous. The guy who did it is already dead. It's over. Miller finally looked at him, a flicker of something pity, maybe in his cold eyes. Nothing is ever over, he said softly. He took the journal from Meyer's unresisting fingers and tucked it away with the photos. Go home, forget you ever found this. Forget the name Leo Kane. Forget you ever spoke to me. Some things are better left buried. He got out of the car and walked back to his truck without another word, leaving them in a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than before. They watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the darkness, leaving them alone. With the ghosts he had just resurrected, they didn't go home. They couldn't. Leo Kane had a hold on them now. His story was a hook that had sunk deep into their flesh. They drove to the local library the next morning, their eyes gritty from a sleepless night. The archives were a dusty collection of microfilm and yellowed newspapers. It didn't take long to find him. Local man's son, missing in High Sierra. The headline from September 2006 was stark. The accompanying photo showed a man in his late 50s, his face etched with a grief so raw it was difficult to look at. He stood on the steps of the sheriff's department, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had the same strong jawline as Leo, the same kind of earnest intensity in his eyes. This was Alistair Kane. In 2006, he was a titan, a ruthless, high-powered attorney from San Francisco, a man known for his scorched-earth litigation tactics and his take-no-prisoners courtroom demeanor. He was powerful, connected, and incandescent with rage and despair. The articles detailed his personal war against the sheriff's department. He'd hired private investigators, bankrolled his own search parties, offered a staggering reward. He'd publicly accused the department of incompetence, of deliberately bungling the investigation. He'd focused all his formidable, terrifying energy on one man, Silas Blackwood. He'd plastered the town with flyers bearing Blackwood's face, calling him a murderer. He'd tried to sue him, to have him arrested, but he had no proof. Just a father's desperate, howling certainty. And then, about a year after Leo disappeared, Alistair Kane had simply stopped. The articles ceased. The private investigators went home. The reward was withdrawn. Alistair Kane sold his law firm, his mansion in Pacific Heights, and disappeared from public life. It was as if his son's disappearance had finally broken him, extinguishing the fire that had fueled him. He had vanished, just like Leo. But there was one other person in this story, the hidden witness, the one who held the missing piece. Her name was Amelia. And in 2006, she was the 18-year-old girl with the laughing eyes in Leo's locket. My heart is yours. Amelia Vance wasn't a backpacker. She was a townie. She'd spent her whole life in the small insular community of Bishop, in the shadow of the mountains that had stolen the boy she loved. In the summer of 2006, she was working as a waitress at the local diner. Saving money for college, her world small and predictable, until Leo Kane walked in. He was just passing through, stocking up on supplies before his big solo trip. They'd talked for hours. He'd told her about his dreams of being a writer, about his complicated relationship with his powerful father. She'd told him about her dream of leaving Bishop, of seeing the world beyond the peaks that walled her in. They'd fallen in love with the swift, hopeless intensity that only the young can manage. It was a 5-day romance that felt like a lifetime. He'd promised to come back for her when his hike was over. He'd given her the locket as a promise. When he went missing, her world shattered. But her pain was invisible, unacknowledged. To the town, to the media, to Alistair Kane, she was nobody. Just a small-town girl, a footnote in the tragic story of a wealthy family's loss. But Amelia knew something she had never told a soul. The day before Leo left for his hike, he'd had a run-in, a confrontation. It happened right outside the diner. A tall, gaunt man, in a dirty red jacket, had been loitering, staring at the tourists with open contempt. Silas Blackwood. Leo, with his easy, open-hearted city confidence, had made a friendly comment. Something about the beautiful weather. Blackwood had turned on him, his eyes full of a sudden, vicious venom. He'd gotten in Leo's face, spitting insults, calling him a rich parasite, a trespasser. He'd told him the mountains didn't want him, that they would spit him out. Leo had been shaken, but had brushed it off as just some crazy local. Amelia had been terrified. She had begged him not to go, to wait, to take her with him. But he was stubborn, determined to prove himself, to complete the solo journey that meant so much to him. He'd promised he would be fine. She had told Deputy Miller about the confrontation. She remembered his face, the way his eyes had gone flat and hard. He'd told her it was probably nothing, that Blackwood was just a harmless crank. He'd advised her, for her own good, to keep quiet about it. He said that getting involved with a man like Alistair Kane would only bring her trouble. She was young, scared, and grieving. So she had kept her secret. She had watched Alistair Kane's desperate public search from the sidelines, her heart aching, the guilt a stone in her stomach. She knew that the animosity between Leo and Silas had started before they ever got into the wilderness. She was the only witness to the spark that had lit the fuse. Now, 19 years later, Amelia Vance was no longer a girl. She was a woman of 37, still living in Bishop. She'd never left. She was a kindergarten teacher at the local elementary school. She was married, with 2 young children. She had built a life for herself, a quiet, safe life, brick by careful brick, over the foundation of her buried grief. The mountains that had once felt like a prison now felt like a sanctuary. But sometimes, when the wind howled down from the peaks at night, she would touch the empty space on her neck, where a silver locket used to hang, and she would remember the laughing boy who had promised to come back for her. She had packed away her guilt, her secret, her grief, just as the mountain had packed away Leo's backpack. But some things can't stay buried forever. Maya and Ben found her name in a small newspaper clipping about a local school fundraiser. They found her address in the phone book. They drove to her house, a modest, pretty bungalow, with a porch swing, and pots of bright red geraniums. A child's bicycle lay overturned on the lawn. It was a scene of perfect, tranquil domesticity. When Amelia opened the door, Maya felt a jolt of recognition. The eyes were the same, older, etched with fine lines of laughter and worry, but still the same joyful, vibrant eyes from the locket. She looked at the 2 young strangers on her doorstep, a flicker of confusion in her face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm and friendly. Maya's own voice was a hoarse whisper. She held out her phone, displaying the faded photo of the locket. "We think we found something that belonged to him," she said. To Leo, the change in Amelia's face was devastating. It was as if a mask crumbled, revealing the 19-year-old girl who was still trapped inside. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a deep, ancient shock. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale waxy white. Her hand flew to her neck, to that empty phantom space, where she breathed, her voice cracking. "How? they told her? Everything. The crevice, the backpack, the journal, the final terrifying photograph. They told her about Deputy Miller, about his strange, guarded reaction, his warning to leave it alone. As they spoke, Amelia's composure shattered. Tears streamed down, her face, silent and unstoppable. She wasn't just crying for the boy she had lost, she was crying for the secret she had kept. For the guilt that had been her constant companion for 19 years. I told him not to go. She sobbed, her body racked with shudders. I told him that man was dangerous. And then she told them about the confrontation outside the diner, the story she had locked away for almost 2 decades. She told them about Silas Blackwood's venomous hatred, about Deputy Miller's cold dismissal of her fears. She described the deputy's face, the hard, flat look in his eyes, the way he had made her feel small and foolish, the way he had intimidated her into silence. A new, more sinister shape began to form in the narrative. Miller wasn't just a wary cop who had failed to solve a case, he was something else. He had been there at the very beginning. He had known about the animosity. He had deliberately suppressed the testimony of the only witness. He had pointed Alistair Cain's rage and resources in a direction, but had he pointed them away from something else, or someone else? The question hung in the air, ugly and unavoidable. Why would a sheriff's deputy protect a violent recluse like Silas Blackwood? Why would he bury a crucial piece of evidence? The puzzle was no longer about a lost hiker and a violent mountain man. It was becoming something far more complex, far more corrupt. The shadow in the final photograph wasn't just Silas Blackwood. It was a conspiracy of silence. An injustice that had been allowed to fester for 19 years in the heart of this small town. And as Amelia wept on her porch, the full weight of what they had unearthed settled upon Maya and Ben. Deputy Miller hadn't just warned them to stay away. He had threatened them. He knew they had the journal and the photos. He knew they had talked to Amelia. He was not a relic of a cold case. He was the guardian of a lie. And he would do anything to keep it from coming to light. The escalating conflict was no longer a matter of history. It had just become their present, and their very, very dangerous future. The first sign that Miller was more than just a passive guardian of old secrets came that night. Maya was driving, her hands clenched on the wheel of their Subaru, Ben silent and brooding in the passenger seat. They were heading out of Bishop. A shared, unspoken decision to put some distance between themselves and the ghosts they'd stirred up. They were halfway to the county line when the flashing lights filled the rearview mirror, a sudden violent explosion of red and blue against the inky blackness of the desert highway. Oh God, Ben breathed. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. She pulled over, the crunch of gravel under the tires sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. In the side mirror, she saw him. Miller. He got out of his cruiser with that same deliberate, unhurried pace, but there was a new tension in his shoulders, a predatory stillness that hadn't been there before. He walked to her window, his face illuminated by the strobing lights, turning his wrinkles into deep, menacing gullies. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "What's this about, Deputy?" Maya asked, trying to keep her own voice from shaking. "I wasn't speeding. You've got a broken taillight," he said, his eyes not on her, but scanning the inside of the car, lingering on the back seat where the backpack had been. Kids are a long way from home. You get lost." "We're just leaving," Ben said, his voice tight. Miller's gaze shifted to him, his pale eyes narrowing. "I told you to go home," he said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational growl. "I told you to forget what you found. You don't listen very well, do you? Talking to people. Stirring things up, that's not smart." He leaned in closer, his arm resting on the open window, his presence filling the car, suffocating them. Maya could smell the stale coffee on his breath again. "Some things in this county have a way of staying buried," he went on, his voice a silky, menacing whisper. "People who come here digging for things they don't understand, they can get hurt. The mountains are a dangerous place. People get lost all the time. Accidents happen. It would be a real shame if 2 more kids from the city had a tragic accident. It was a direct threat, bald and terrifying. There was no ambiguity. He wasn't a cop enforcing the law. He was a predator marking his territory. He was telling them that the same fate that had befallen Leo Kane could easily befall them. He straightened up, a humorless smirk twisting his lips. "I'm going to let you go with a warning this time." For the taillight, he tapped the roof of their car, a gesture that was both a dismissal and a final, chilling assertion of dominance. "But I don't want to see you in my county again, ever, am I clear?" He walked back to his cruiser without waiting for a reply. They sat there, paralyzed, until his taillights were a distant pinprick of red in the darkness. Then Maya slammed her hand on the steering wheel, a surge of rage momentarily eclipsing her fear. "He's not protecting Silas Blackwood," she said, her voice shaking with dawning horror. "He's protecting himself." The realization was a seismic shock. The narrative they had constructed, the story of a violent recluse and a bungled investigation, was a lie. A carefully constructed lie. Miller hadn't just suppressed Amelia's testimony. He had manufactured a suspect. He had taken Alistair Kane's fury and aimed it like a weapon at a convenient scapegoat. A man the town already feared and distrusted. And for 19 years, it had worked. They drove through the night. Not to their home in the Bay Area, but east, towards the barren plains of Nevada. They needed to think, to hide. They felt like fugitives. Miller's threat hung over them, a promise of violence that felt sickeningly real. They found a cheap, anonymous motel off a lonely stretch of highway. The kind of place with flickering neon and peeling paint. The room smelled of bleach and despair. Maya sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, her mind racing, replaying every detail. Every conversation. Why, she kept asking, over and over. Why would he do it? What did Leo have that he wanted? Ben, who had been pacing the room like a caged animal, stopped. "Maybe it wasn't about what Leo had," he said slowly. "Maybe it was about what Leo saw." The words hung in the stale air. What if Leo, on his solo journey into the heart of the wilderness, had stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see? Something Miller was involved in. Silas Blackwood, the poacher, the recluse. What if he wasn't just a random boogeyman? What if he was a partner? They needed more than just a gut feeling. They needed proof. The journal was gone. The photos were gone, all taken by Miller. They had nothing but their word against a decorated, long-serving officer of the law. They were two kids who had found a backpack. Who would believe them? The answer, of course, was Alistair Kane. The one man whose life had been destroyed by Miller's lie. The one man with the resources and the motivation to burn it all to the ground. But he had vanished 19 years ago. Finding him felt impossible. Their only link was Amelia. Terrified, traumatized Amelia, who had already been intimidated into silence once. They called her the next morning from a burner phone they bought at a gas station. Her voice was thin, reedy with fear. "He came to my house," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Last night, after you left Miller, he just sat in his car, parked across their street for hours, just watching. He didn't have to say anything. I knew what it meant." The tendrils of Miller's intimidation were long, reaching out to terrorize the one person who could corroborate their story. He was isolating them, systematically dismantling their credibility and their courage. "Amelia, we need to find Leo's father," Maya said, her voice urgent. "Alistair, do you have any idea where he went?" There was a long pause. "No," she said, her voice full of despair. "After he gave up the search, he just disappeared. People said he went mad with grief. I don't think he ever spoke to anyone from Bishop again. It was a dead end. They were alone, hunted, and out of options. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a bitter acid in the back of Maya's throat. Miller was going to get away with it. He had controlled the narrative for 19 years, and he was going to control it until he died, taking his secret to the grave. Leo's ghost would remain trapped in that crevice. His last moments a secret kept by a corrupt cop. The betrayal felt immense, a gaping wound. It wasn't just the betrayal of Leo, But the betrayal of the uniform Miller wore, of the trust the community had placed in him. How many other secrets was he keeping? What other darkness was hidden beneath the placid surface of that small town? The witness, Amelia, was trapped in a cage of fear, her life and her family threatened by the silent, watchful presence of the man who was supposed to protect them. She was a victim as much as Leo was, her life sentence one of quiet terror and unresolved grief. She had come so close to freedom, to unburdening herself of the secret that had poisoned her life, only to have the door slammed shut again, more violently this time. The conflict had escalated from a historical mystery to a present-day war. Miller was no longer just hiding. He was actively hunting them, using the power of his badge as a weapon. He had the law, the system, and 19 years of lies on his side. They had nothing but a 19-year-old photograph of a dead boy's terror-filled eyes. Ben, who had been scrolling frantically through the archives on his laptop, suddenly went still. "I think I found something," he said, his voice low. He turned the laptop around. It was an old article, a small human interest piece from a San Francisco Society page, dated about 10 years ago. It was about a charity auction for a children's hospital. There was a photo of a woman, elegant and poised, with kind eyes and a sad, gentle smile. The caption identified her as Eleanor Vance. Vance? Maya asked, her brow furrowing. "Like Amelia, she's a pediatric oncologist," Ben read from the article. "It says she's the sister of the late Alastair Kane." Alastair Kane was dead. The news hit them with a strange, hollow thud. The White Knight they had been hoping to find, the powerful avenger who would ride in and deliver justice, was gone. They had been chasing a ghost, but his sister was alive, and Aunt Leo had, probably known, a woman who had also lost her nephew. A new name, a new, fragile thread of hope. The article says she practices at the Children's Hospital in Oakland. Ben said, his eyes meeting Maya's. It was a long shot, a desperate Hail Mary pass. But it was the only one they had. They packed their single bag, checked out of the grimy motel, and started driving west, back towards the Lion's Den. Back towards the Bay Area, where the story had begun, and where, with any luck, they might find the one person left who had the power to help them end it. As they drove, the sun setting behind them, casting long, distorted shadows across the highway. Maya couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Miller's cruiser cresting the hill behind them. The world felt thin, insubstantial, as if they had slipped through a crack in reality and were now living in the dark, terrifying world of Leo's last journal entry. The danger was no longer a vague threat. It was a living, breathing thing. Miller wasn't just a corrupt cop, he was a murderer, and he had a 19-year head start. He had spent those years burying his crime, not just in the earth, but in the fears and secrets of an entire town. He had turned Silas Blackwood into a monster to hide the monster he was himself. He had silenced Amelia, terrorized her, held her family hostage with a single silent glance. And now he had turned his cold, predatory gaze on them. They had the one thing that could destroy him, the beginning of the truth, and he knew it. This was no longer about finding out what happened to Leo Kane. It was about surviving long enough to tell his story. The stakes had been raised from justice to life and death. Their own, Dr. Eleanor Vance, was exactly what her Society page photo had suggested. Elegant, composed, with a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. Her office at the Oakland Children's Hospital was a place of gentle hope, the walls covered in crayon drawings from her small patients. But when Maya and Ben told her why they were there, when they said the name Leo, the professional calm shattered, and the aunt who had lost her nephew 19 years ago emerged, her eyes, so kind a moment before, filled with a familiar, bottomless grief. "Alastair is gone," she said, her voice a soft, pained whisper. "He died 6 years ago. His heart, it just gave out. He never recovered from losing Leo. It hollowed him out." She listened to their story, her face a mask of escalating horror. She listened to the details of the backpack, the journal, the final, terrible photograph. She listened to their account of Deputy Miller's threats, of his systematic intimidation of Amelia Vance. When they were finished, the silence in the room was heavy, thick with the weight of 19 years of unanswered questions. "I never believed the official story," Eleanor said, her hands clenched in her lap. Alistair was obsessed, convinced that man Blackwood was responsible, but it never felt right. "Miller, I remember him. He seemed so helpful at first, so sympathetic. But he was the one who kept pointing Alistair towards Blackwood. Every tip, every supposed lead, it always led back to the mountain man. He was feeding my brother's obsession, stoking his rage." She stood up and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of her office. "Alistair left everything to me when he died. His legal files, his personal effects. Most of it was just the wreckage of his grief. But he kept everything from the investigation. Every note, every file. He was a lawyer, after all. He documented everything." She pulled out a large, dusty cardboard box labeled Leo for The next few hours, the three of them became archivists of a tragedy. They sifted through piles of paper, private investigator reports, maps of the search area, transcripts of interviews, Alistair's own furious handwritten notes. It was a monument to a father's despair. And then, at the very bottom of the box, Ben found it. It was a small, digital voice recorder, the kind journalists used back in the mid-2000s. Taped to it was a note in Alistair's jagged script. "Miller interview, September 28, 2006. He's lying." Alistair recorded his conversations with everyone involved, Eleanor explained, her voice trembling. He trusted no one. Ben pressed the play button. The audio quality was poor, tinny, and filled with static. First, they heard Alistair's voice, raw with pain and anger, demanding answers. Then came the slow, measured tones of Deputy Miller.com, reassuring and utterly duplicitous. "Miller. Alistair, I understand your frustration. We're doing everything we can, but the wilderness, it doesn't give up its secrets easily. All the evidence we have points to Mr. Blackwood. His history of violence, his animosity towards outsiders, his presence in the area. Alistair, evidence? You have no evidence. You have the word of a few drunks he goes hunting with. You haven't searched his cabin properly. You haven't brought him in for a real interrogation. Miller, we can't harass a man without probable cause. His alibi, as thin as it is, holds up. We have to follow procedure." It was in deflection and control. Miller was patiently, skillfully, managing a grieving father, steering him down a path that led to a dead end. But then, near the end of the recording, something shifted. "Alistair, my son, mentioned a waitress in Bishop, Amelia Vance. He said she was a sweet girl. Did you talk to her? Did she know anything?" There was a pause, a beat of silence that stretched for a fraction too long. When Miller answered, there was a new, almost imperceptible edge to his voice. "Miller, I did." The girl was distraught, of course. Head over heels for your son after a few days. She was confused, emotional. She mentioned some minor disagreement Leo had with Blackwood in town. Nothing serious. A few harsh words. "I told her not to get her hopes up, that it was likely meaningless. In her state, she could be an unreliable witness. It's best not to involve the poor girl any further." Maya's breath caught in her throat. It was the lie. The cold, calculated lie that had buried the truth for 19 years. He was dismissing Amelia, painting her as a hysterical, lovesick girl, deliberately devaluing her testimony in the eyes of Leo's powerful father. But that wasn't the twist. The twist came after the official interview seemed to end. They heard the sound of a chair scraping back. But Alistair hadn't stopped the recording. Maybe he forgot, or maybe it was intentional. For about 30 seconds, there was just the sound of rustling papers. And then, Miller's voice came again, much closer to the recorder, his tone completely different. It was a low, conspiratorial murmur. He thought Alistair was out of the room. He was talking to someone else. Miller almost lost it there. He brought up the girl. "The waitress? A second voice answered, a voice they hadn't heard before. It was younger, higher-pitched, and laced with panic. Second voice. What? Did you tell him? Does he know she saw us? Miller, calm down. I handled it. I told him she was an emotional wreck, unreliable. He bought it, but you need to be more careful. You were sloppy, getting into a pissing match with the kid in broad daylight where she could see you. That was stupid. Rick. The name hung in the air, electric and damning. Rick. Rick. I didn't know who he was. He just came out of nowhere. This smiling, golden boy, acting like he owned the place. It pissed me off. And then he just kept going, hiking right up towards the pass. Right where we had the drop set up. It was just bad luck. Miller, bad luck we dealt with. Now it stays dealt with. Blackwood is taking the heat. Kane is breathing down his neck. Everyone is looking at the crazy mountain man. No one is looking at us, and it's going to stay that way, you understand me? You keep your mouth shut. You go back to being a good little deputy. You forget this ever happened. The recording clicked off. The room was utterly silent. The full, horrifying truth had just unspooled from a 19-year-old digital recorder. It wasn't Miller and Silas Blackwood. It was Miller and another deputy, Rick. Leo. Kane hadn't stumbled upon a poacher. He had stumbled upon a police conspiracy. A drop in the mountains. Drugs. Illegal weapons. Something valuable enough, something criminal enough, to kill for. Leo, the innocent hiker, the writer, the boy in love, had hiked straight into a criminal enterprise run by the very men who were supposed to be enforcing the law. And the final photograph. The shadow behind Leo. It wasn't one man, it was two. Miller and Rick. The terror in Leo's eyes wasn't just fear of a random, violent man. It was the dawning, soul-destroying horror of realizing his killers were cops. The people he would have run to for help were the very source of his doom. There was no escape. The plot twist was a gut punch. It recontextualized everything. Miller's careful control, his manipulation of Alistair, his intimidation of Amelia. His threats against Maya and Bennett was all the desperate, frantic maneuvering of a man not just covering up a murder, but protecting a criminal operation. The case had just exploded. This wasn't about personal pain anymore. This was a public scandal of the highest order. A scandal of police corruption, murder, and a 19-year cover-up that had destroyed one of the most powerful families in the state. Eleanor Vance was pale, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of vindicated horror and fresh grief. The monster her brother had hunted was a fiction. The real monster had been shaking his hand, offering condolences. All while knowing he had put a bullet in his son. Rick, Eleanor whispered, her mind racing. Rick Peterson. He was young then, just a rookie. Miller's protege. Everyone said he worshipped him. Ben was already on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. A few seconds later, he swore under his breath. He's still there. He's Captain Rick Peterson now. Second in command of the entire damn department. The conspiracy wasn't just a secret kept by one aging deputy. It was embedded in the very power structure of the county's law enforcement. Miller wasn't a lone wolf, he was the kingmaker. He had gotten away with murder and had spent the next 19 years grooming his accomplice, promoting him, placing him in a position of ultimate power and trust. They had a stranglehold on the county. The tension cranked to an almost unbearable level. They had the truth. They had the proof on a small digital recorder. But the men they had to expose were the ones in charge. To go to the local police would be to hand themselves over to the murderers. To go to the press could be just as dangerous. Miller and Peterson would know the story was about to break. They would do anything to stop it, to discredit them, to make them disappear, just like Leo. Asterisk, they were holding a bomb. The question was, how to detonate it without getting caught in the blast. They were 3 civilians against 2 powerful, corrupt, and murderous cops who had everything to lose. The stakes had shifted from a quest for justice to a high-stakes thriller. Their next move wouldn't just determine whether Leo's story was ever told. It would determine whether they lived to see another day. The cinematic payoff was no longer an abstract idea. It was a tactical necessity for their own survival, and it had to be perfect. The plan was audacious, reckless, and their only option. It was Eleanor's idea, born of a lawyer's mind, but fueled by an aunt's grief. They couldn't go to the police. They couldn't trust a quiet leak to the press. They had to create a moment. A public spectacle so explosive, so undeniable, that Miller and Peterson would have no time to spin a new lie, no corner to hide in. They had to stage a courtroom bombshell. But without a courtroom, the chosen venue was the annual Sheriff's Department community picnic and awards ceremony. It was a public relations stunt, a carefully orchestrated performance of civic harmony, held in the main town square in Bishop. It was, the one day a year, the entire department, from the sheriff down to the newest rookie, presented itself to the community it supposedly served. And this year, there was a special presentation. A Lifetime Achievement Award for Deputy Frank Miller. Celebrating his 40 years of service before his impending retirement. His protege, Captain Rick Peterson, would be presenting the award. It was perfect. A stage, a captive audience, and the two killers, together. Basking in the public's trust, the days leading up to it were a blur of adrenaline and paranoia. Eleanor, using her considerable wealth and old connections, worked behind the scenes. She hired a top-tier cybersecurity firm to create a protected, untraceable server. She contacted a single, trusted journalist, a Pulitzer Prize winner from a national paper known for her tenacity and her discretion, providing her with just enough information to ensure she would be there, cameras ready. Maya and Ben's job was the most dangerous. They had to get the audio to the right people at the right time. They worked with Eleanor's tech team to rig the town square's public address system. It was an old system, easy to hack. They would override it, turning the celebratory speakers into instruments of judgment. Amelia Vance was their ace in the hole. After a long, tearful phone call with Eleanor, who apologized for Alistair's blindness and for the years of silence, Amelia found a new kind of courage. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, protective rage. She was no longer just a witness. She was an advocate. For Leo, for the girl she used to be, for her own children, who deserved to grow up in a town not ruled by murderers. Her role was simple, but crucial. She just had to be there, in the front row. She had to be the face of the truth. The day of the picnic was bright and sunny, a perfect California day. The town square was filled with families, with the smell of barbecue and the sound of children laughing. It was a scene of idyllic small-town life, a perfect facade for the darkness that festered beneath. Maya and Ben sat in a van parked a block away, a laptop open between them, their hearts pounding in time with the cheerful marching band music playing over the PA system. Eleanor was in the crowd, a small, elegant woman in a sun hat, indistinguishable from any other citizen. And Amelia was in the front row, her expression calm, her gaze fixed on the stage. The ceremony began. Speeches were made. Plaques were handed out. Then, the sheriff introduced Captain Rick Peterson to present the final award. Peterson stepped up to the podium, a man in his early 40s, handsome, confident, the very picture of a modern, trustworthy police officer. He smiled warmly at the crowd. For 40 years, he began, his voice smooth and practiced. This department, and this community, has been blessed with the service of a true legend. A man who has been a mentor, a partner, and a friend too. So many of us. He taught me what it means to be a cop, what it means to protect and serve. He turned to Miller, who was seated on the stage, looking old and frail and humble. Basking in the applause, Frank Peterson said, his voice thick with emotion, "It is my profound honor to present you with this Lifetime Achievement Award. You are the soul of this department." He held up the gleaming plaque. The crowd roared its approval. In the van, Maya took a deep breath. "Now," she said. Ben hit the enter key. The marching band music abruptly cut off. A loud screech of feedback echoed through the square, making people jump, and then, silence. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. On the stage, Peterson frowned, tapping the microphone. And then, Alistair Kane's voice, raw with 19-year-old grief, erupted from the speakers, crackling with static. My son mentioned a waitress. In Bishop, Amelia Vance. Did you talk to her? A wave of shock washed over the crowd. On the stage, Miller's folksy smile froze. His eyes darted around, a flicker of panic in their pale depths. Peterson went rigid, his hand tightening on the podium. Then came Miller's voice, the smooth, dismissive tone suddenly sinister in the open air of the town square. In her state, she could be an unreliable witness. It's best not to involve the poor girl any further. The crowd was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the stage. And in the front row, Amelia Vance stood up. She wasn't crying. Her face was a mask of cold, righteous fury. She just stood there, her presence a silent, damning accusation. Miller saw her. The blood drained from his face. He looked like he had seen a ghost. And then the second part of the recording played. The part no one was ever meant to hear. Miller's voice, low and conspiratorial, almost lost it there. He brought up the girl, the waitress. Peterson's younger, panicked voice filled the square. What? Did you tell him? Does he know she saw us? A collective gasp went through the crowd. People were turning to look at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. The sheriff, standing at the side of the stage, looked utterly bewildered. And then, the final damning lines. Miller, bad luck we dealt with, now it stays dealt with. Blackwood is taking the heat, no one is looking at us. And it's going to stay that way, you understand me? You keep your mouth shut, you go back to being a good little deputy. You forget this ever happened. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. It was the silence of a town holding its breath. The silence of a 19-year-old lie finally being strangled in the light of day. Then chaos erupted. People started shouting, pointing at the stage. The national journalist Eleanor had contacted, was already there, her camera crew pushing through the crowd. Their lens pointed directly at the two men on the stage. Peterson looked like he had been turned to stone. His face a grotesque mask of disbelief and terror. But Miller, the old wolf, reacted. He lunged for the side of the stage, his body moving with a surprising, desperate agility. He was trying to run, but the crowd, his community, the people who had trusted him for 40 years, had become a wall. They weren't a mob. They were just standing there, ordinary citizens, their faces hard with betrayal, blocking his path. He was trapped. And then, the most cinematic moment of all. From the back of the crowd, two men in dark suits began pushing their way forward. They moved with a calm, implacable authority that cut through the chaos. FBI Eleanor had made one more call, not to the state police, who might have local loyalties, but to the feds. They walked onto the stage, past the stunned sheriff, and stopped in front of the two men. One agent approached Captain Rick Peterson, who seemed to shrink inside his crisp uniform, the color draining from his face. The agent spoke in a low, clear voice that was somehow audible over the rising clamor. Captain Peterson, you're under arrest for the murder of Leo Kane. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The sharp, metallic click as they closed around Peterson's wrists echoed through the silent PA system like a gunshot. The other agent faced Miller. The old man had slumped against the podium, his face gray, all the fight gone out of him. He looked defeated, ancient, a hollowed-out ruin. He didn't even look up as the agent read him his rights and cuffed him. The public arrest was a bombshell. It was a scandal breaking the internet in real time, captured on a dozen cell phone cameras and the professional lens of a national news crew. The cheers that had celebrated a hero minutes before were replaced by the shouts of reporters and the quiet, stunned sobs of a community betrayed. Maya and Ben watched it all unfold on their laptop screen. A live feed from the journalists' camera. They saw Amelia, tears finally streaming down her face, being embraced by Eleanor Vance, two women bound by a shared loss. finding a moment of bittersweet solace in the public ruin of the men who had caused their pain. The payoff was complete. It was public, it was explosive, it was emotionally cathartic. The shadow from Leo's final photograph had been dragged, kicking and screaming, into the harsh, unforgiving light. The conspiracy of silence was shattered, its architects humiliated and exposed in front of the very people they had sworn to protect. Justice, after 19 long, silent years, had finally arrived, and it had arrived with a vengeance. The trial was a media circus, a national obsession. The story of the Golden Boy, the corrupt cops, and the backpack in the mountains was irresistible. The audio recording was the centerpiece, an undeniable confession from the mouths of the killers themselves. The defense tried to argue it was fabricated, a high-tech forgery orchestrated by a vengeful, grieving family. But the cybersecurity firm Eleanor had hired provided unassailable proof of its authenticity. And then Amelia Vance took the stand. She was no longer the terrified girl or the frightened mother. She was a woman transformed, imbued with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She told her story, her voice clear and steady. She told the court about the laughing, vibrant boy who had stolen her heart in 5 days. She described the confrontation with Silas Blackwood, her fear, her pleas for Leo not to go. And then she told them about Deputy Miller, about his cold dismissal, his intimidation, the way he had made her feel small and powerless. She looked directly at Miller and Peterson, who sat at the defendant's table, their faces pale and drawn. She was not afraid of them anymore. Her testimony was the human heart of the trial, the emotional truth that gave context to the cold, hard evidence of the recording. Miller and Peterson were convicted on all charges: murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The camera flashes caught their faces as they were led from the courtroom. 2 old broken men, their legacies forever erased and rewritten as monsters. A month after the verdict, Maya, Ben, Eleanor, and Amelia drove back up into the High Sierra. It was a crisp, clear autumn day. The aspens had turned a brilliant, fiery gold, and the air was sharp and clean. They didn't talk much on the drive. There was a sense of quiet purpose, of a final, necessary pilgrimage. They hiked for hours. Following the old trail, Leo had taken. Eleanor, though in her 60s, was surprisingly resilient, her determination etched on her face. Amelia moved with a familiar grace, the mountains no longer a place of fear, but a place of remembrance. They finally reached the spot, the ledge, the crevice. It looked so ordinary now, just a feature in a vast, indifferent landscape. It was hard to believe it had held such a terrible secret for so long. They had brought a small, simple plaque with them. It was bronze, designed to weather and blend with the rock over time. Eleanor knelt and placed it on the ledge, right beside the fissure that had been Leo's tomb. The inscription was simple: Leo Kane, 19832-006, son, nephew, friend. The mountains keep their secrets, but the truth finds the light. He loved this world. They stood there for a long time, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the pines. It wasn't a grave marker, not really. Leo's remains had never been found. The search crews had scoured the area after the trial, but the mountains were vast, and 19 years was a long time. This was something else. It was a memorial, an acknowledgement, a final quiet reclaiming of the narrative. Amelia stepped forward and placed something on the ledge beside the plaque. It was a single perfect wildflower, its petals a brilliant, defiant blue against the grey granite. Then, she took a small, tarnished silver locket from her pocket. It was the one Leo had given her, the twin to the one he had carried. She had kept it hidden away for all these years. She opened it, looked at the laughing picture of her younger self for a long moment, then closed it and placed it next to the flower. A final letting go. He would have loved that you two found him, Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. Looking at Maya and Ben, he was always drawn to people with adventurous, stubborn spirits. Like his own, Maya felt tears welling in her eyes. It had started as a climb, an adventure. But it had become something so much more profound. It had changed them, woven their lives into a story of tragedy and justice. As they began the long hike back down, a sense of peace settled over them. It was a bittersweet peace, tinged with the sadness of what had been lost, but a kind of peace nonetheless. The ghosts of the High Sierra felt a little quieter now. The national scandal faded, as all scandals do, replaced by new headlines, new outrages. The town of Bishop slowly began to heal. Its trust shattered, but its foundations now built on a hard-won truth. The sheriff's department was gutted, rebuilt from the ground up under the watchful eye of federal oversight. Maya and Ben finished their final year of college. The experience had altered the course of their lives. Ben, the carefree rock climber, decided to go to law school, a fire for justice lit within him. Maya, always the more introspective one, became a writer. She wrote Leo's story, not as a sensational true crime thriller, but as a quiet, powerful novel about love, loss, and the enduring power of truth. It was her way of giving him back the voice he had lost. Years later, Maya returned to the mountains alone. She hiked to the ledge, now a familiar and sacred place. The bronze plaque was still there, weathered and streaked with green, looking as if it had always been a part of the rock. The wildflower was long gone, but the silver locket remained, nestled in a small crack. Tarnished but whole, she sat on the edge of the granite slab, looking out at the endless sea of peaks. The same view Leo must have seen in his final, peaceful moments before the shadow fell. The story was over. Justice had been served. The killers were in prison. The truth was out, but the cost was immeasurable. A young life, full of promise, extinguished. A father who died of a broken heart. A young woman's life, forever altered. By a 5-day romance and a 19-year secret, the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The silence was no longer watching or menacing. It was just silence. Deep, profound, and peaceful. It was the haunting reflection of what had been gained, and the tragic, permanent reminder of all that had been lost. The emotional echo of Leo Kane's life, and his death, would linger here forever, a permanent part of the granite, the wind, and the sky. A story that was, finally, at rest.